On the morning of April 16, 2014, the passenger ferry MV Sewol departed Incheon, South Korea, bound for Jeju Island. On board were 476 people, many of them high school students on a long-anticipated class trip. For most passengers, it was supposed to be a routine overnight voyage, one final stretch of travel before vacation began. By the end of the day, the ferry would be partially submerged, hundreds would be missing, and South Korea would be plunged into one of the deepest national traumas in its modern history. The story of the Sewol disaster is not one of sudden catastrophe alone. It's a story shaped by decisions made long before the ship ever left port. Decisions involving cost-cutting, regulatory failure, and a culture that valued schedule and profit over safety. The Sewol wasn't originally built for South Korean waters. Constructed in Japan in 1994, the ship had operated safely for years before being sold to a Korean company in 2012. After the purchase, the ferry underwent extensive and poorly regulated modifications. Extra passenger cabins were added, interior spaces were expanded, and most critically, the ship's center of gravity was raised, making it inherently less stable. To compensate, operators were supposed to reduce cargo limits and ballast water. Instead, the Sewol routinely sailed overloaded, carrying far more cargo than regulations allowed. On its final voyage, the ferry was carrying more than 3 times its permitted cargo weight, much of it inadequately secured. Vehicles, shipping containers, and heavy equipment were improperly restrained or not restrained at all. Even before April 16th, the Sewol showed warning signs. Crew members had expressed concerns about stability, reports had been filed, but inspections were superficial and enforcement was lax. The ferry was allowed to keep operating. Shortly after 8:40 a.m., as the Sewol passed through the Bengal Channel, the ship executed a sharp turn, a maneuver well within normal operating limits for a properly loaded vessel. But the Sewol was not properly loaded. The sudden turn caused unsecured cargo to shift violently to one side. Almost immediately, the ferry began to list sharply. Water poured in through openings on the vehicle deck, and within minutes, the ship had tilted more than 30 degrees. Passengers were thrown from their feet, furniture slid across decks, and panic spread quickly. Yet, instead of ordering an immediate evacuation, the crew made a decision that would define the disaster. Over the ship's public address system, passengers were told to remain in their cabins. The announcement was repeated multiple times. Many passengers obeyed, students texted their parents, and some filmed videos as water crept closer. They trusted that help was coming, that the instructions were being given with their safety in mind. But as the ferry continued to list, time became the most valuable resource on board. Crew members, meanwhile, were struggling. Some lacked proper training, others panicked. The captain delayed issuing an evacuation order, unsure of how quickly the situation was deteriorating. By the time the severity of the disaster was undeniable, escape routes were compromised, stairwells were flooded, and doors were blocked. The angle of the ship made movement nearly impossible. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Sewol disaster is what happened next. As passengers remained inside, many crew members evacuated early, some boarding rescue vessels without ensuring passengers had escaped. The captain himself left the ship while hundreds were still trapped inside. Outside, rescue efforts were chaotic and slow. The Coast Guard arrived quickly, but coordination was poor. Helicopters focused on evacuating those already visible on deck, while little effort was made to enter the ship and rescue those still inside. Divers were not deployed immediately, and confusion over command authority caused delays. Precious minutes and then hours passed. By early afternoon, the Sewol had capsized almost completely, leaving only a portion of the hull visible above water. As news spread, families gathered near the coast, watching live broadcasts of the partially submerged ferry. Many were told, incorrectly, that most passengers had already been rescued. This misinformation would later become another source of national outrage. Parents waited for phone calls that never came, rescue updates were vague and contradictory, and hope slowly turned into dread as hours passed with no confirmed rescues. By the end of the first day, it was clear the disaster was far worse than initially reported. In total, 304 people died in the Sewol disaster. 250 of them were students from the Donwon High School. Entire classrooms were lost, along with teachers who tried to help their students escape. Survivors later spoke of hearing voices in the dark, of classmates calling for help that never came. The emotional impact on South Korea was profound. Yellow ribbons became symbols of mourning, Public memorials filled city squares, and schools held empty graduation ceremonies. The disaster exposed not just a failure of a ship, but a failure of systems meant to protect the public. Investigations revealed a chain of negligence at nearly every level. The ferry's modifications had never been properly approved, cargo limits were ignored, and safety inspections were rushed or falsified. Crew training was also inadequate, with emergency protocols poorly understood. The captain was later convicted of negligence and sentenced to life in prison. Other crew members and company officials were also prosecuted. But for many families, these sentences felt insufficient. They argued that responsibility extended beyond individuals to regulators, inspectors, and a culture that tolerated shortcuts. Public anger eventually led to the dissolution of South Korea's Coast Guard, replaced with a restructured agency aimed at improving disaster response. In 2017, nearly 3 years after the disaster, the Sewol was finally raised from the sea floor. The operation was watched closely by the public, not just as a technical achievement, but as an emotional reckoning. Human remains were recovered, evidence was examined, and questions continued to linger. Even now, debate remains over whether the full truth of the disaster has been uncovered. Some families believe critical information was withheld. Others argue that systemic reform came too slowly. What remains undisputed is the lesson the Sewol disaster left behind. It's remembered not only for its scale, but for its avoidable nature. It unfolded in calm seas on a clear morning during a routine voyage. It happened because warnings were ignored, rules were bent, and when crisis came, leadership failed. Today, the ferry no longer rests beneath the water, but its legacy remains deeply embedded in South Korean society. Annual memorials are held, names are read aloud, and questions are still asked. The Sewol reminds us that disasters are rarely the result of a single moment. They are often built quietly, decision by decision, until one ordinary day exposes everything that went wrong. And for the families who lost loved ones, the tragedy is not history. It's ongoing, a reminder of what happens when safety becomes secondary and when trust is misplaced at the moment it matters most. Thank you everybody for watching the video. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd really appreciate the support.